Keith did not have the heart to let Lance sleep on a carpet that smelled like smoke and rat carcass. So, he let Lance get some sleep on a mattress while he started making some ramen. He was tempted to eat 2 packs, but he knew he had to ration. If he wanted a chance to buy some breakfast in the morning, he needed to save. Do angels eat? Is he going to get hungry like I do? Keith had no idea how angels could operate. Maybe they never suffered. That would be lucky. It would make him jealous, but it would mean he wouldn't have to spend as much money on Lance. He was now thinking about what Lance had said, typed, an hour ago. Keith being envious of others because he was lonely didn't sound that far away from how he actually felt. He poured ramen from a pot into a bowl, not shying away from the boiling hot water as some got on his skin. He would think of himself as more guilty than envious. Envy didn't sound exactly right, is the point he was trying to prove to himself. He silently decided Lance likely just wanted an excuse to stick around. Poor guy. Getting kicked out of heaven sounded terrible. Keith wasn't exactly kicked out of the underworld, so he couldn't exactly relate. But he could understand. The homesickness hit him sometimes. And maybe Lance would get that way too. Maybe the two would be good for each other. 2 ethereal souls cast out from their homelands, despite the major differences between them. Keith got a fork and started eating his ramen as quietly as possible while leaning against the kitchen counter behind him. He winced whenever he would hear his fork clink or Sane forbid scraping against the bowl's bottom. Despite the angel being mildly annoying, he didn't intend to stoke any flames between them. The last thing he wanted was to have a fight with an angel, even a fallen one. Keith finished his bowl pretty fast and looked down at the little bit of broth still left at the bottom. With a sigh, he went to rinse out the bowl and wrung his now wet hands over the sink. Now, he had to contemplate where he was going to sleep. He didn't really have any options, except maybe the bathtub. He could take a pillow in there, but he only had 1 blanket. That was taken by Lance already. Keith looked down at the sleeping angel in his living room and wondered what the hell he had gotten himself into. While he was contemplating sleeping on the floor, Lance opened his eyes a little and looked up at Keith. Keith was stunned a little, and Lance smirked up at him as he sat up. His arms were holding him up for a moment before he actually sat, crossing his legs underneath him in a childish manner. He looked up at Keith with a quizzical look before patting the spot next to him on the bed. He could hear the pats even as he stole one last glance at his phone. He couldn't have it on the bed, and it was almost dead. The charger was one of the shortest he had ever seen. Due to that, he had to go over and plug the device in near the wall before sitting down next to Lance. Lance made those chirping noises again, and Keith wasn't sure why he was trying to talk. He thought it had been established. Keith couldn't understand Lance, and he had reason to believe Lance couldn't understand him. He wondered if he sounded like a bird too. It wouldn't fit him. Lance at least had the wings for it. Keith listened to the chirping for a few more moments before realizing it wasn't ending anytime soon. He put a hand over Lance's mouth. "Stop talking. It's annoying." His voice was lower than normal, and his brow was furrowed. He hoped that it was obvious what he was communicating, despite the issue they had. When he let go of Lance's mouth, he was kinda surprised Lance hadn't bit or licked his hand. He seemed like the type to do that sort of thing, and don't get him wrong, Keith was grateful he didn't. Angels may have rabies, but he wouldn't know. The amount he didn't know about angels concerned him, actually. Not knowing much about this guy's kind could put him in danger without him even knowing. Lance suddenly put a wing around Keith's shoulders, which confused him. "What are you—" He was suddenly pulled into the angel's side, and he felt like he was on fire. He knew how that felt. He was a fire demon after all. Fire for him felt intense, but he could get used to it. It didn't harm him. That aptly explained how he felt at this very moment. He let Lance hug him to his side with his wing for a few moments before he stood up. Keith wanted to sleep, and he had decided on the floor. He grabbed a pillow as Lance watched him with a curious expression, his eyes following Keith's every move. Eyes being on him was uncomfortable, so he tried to keep his back turned and ignored them. Keith put his pillow on the ground and started to lay down when he heard a loud chirp. "Lance?" Keith turned his head to look at Lance, who was now standing up with his arms crossed and a finger tapping. It reminded Keith of his late mother. Specifically, whenever he wouldn't put his igneous rock toys away and she would tell him she was disappointed. He would have preferred not to have thought about his mother at that moment. The memory usually made him feel a little more emotional. Lance stomped up to Keith and grabbed the pillow. "Hey, what are you doing?" Lance threw the pillow back on the bed and grabbed Keith by the arms, picking him up to stand on his feet. He let go of one of his arms, but kept one to pull Keith to the mattress. Being controlled was not something Keith enjoyed. That was likely the fire demon part of him. no matter if it was because he was a fire demon or not. It was still him. Despite being pulled onto the bed, Keith struggled against Lance's hold. He was able to wrench himself away into standing again, spinning around to lock eyes with the angel on his mattress. That is not happening. Keith shook his head no and crossed his arms. I'll gladly take the floor. Though he knew Lance couldn't understand him, he hoped maybe his tone and facial expressions could help. Lance frowned and stood up from the mattress while Keith backed up to lean against a wall. Lance came over, and before Keith could say anything, Lance had put his back and wings against the wall, sliding down to sit against it. Keith watched Lance put his wings up around him like a cocoon. Could he sleep like that? It was now he realized Lance was offering him his mattress, and at this point he was honestly too tired to argue or ask about it. His morning started with a loud bang in the kitchen, and he swore he had whiplash from how fast he got up. When he looked in the kitchen, Keith was greeted with the most pleasant sight of an angel, staring at him wide-eyed and in shock. Keith's sleepy mind finally caught up. The noise must have been one of the cabinets. The hinges only allowed it to stay open if you were holding onto it. Otherwise, it would slam shut. Keith mumbled out, "It's fine," though he knew Lance wouldn't be able to understand. Lance followed him back to the living room, while Keith was grabbing his phone. He had 9 missed calls from Pidge, and her messages ranged from concerned to angry, to concerned again. Keith knew they likely thought he may have died to this angel that he had vaguely spoken about. He hung his head and tilted the phone away from Lance's sight while he responded to his only Earth friend. "Thank you for your concern, Pidge. The angel's name is Lance. Apparently he was kicked out of heaven. I think he's staying with me until he can navigate Earth on his own." Pidge responded incredibly fast. According to what Keith knew about her, she had likely slept all afternoon and woke up while he was sleeping at a normal time.
Angels dropping their own on Earth like that? Wouldn't be surprised. Though demons can't talk to angels, there's supposed to be a spell that garbles your voice. Can you understand him?
The half-demon asked with genuine sincerity. Keith glanced up at the angel in his home, who was actually just slipping into the bathroom. He sounds like he chirps when he talks, so no. He can text, though.
Be careful. Angels can be just as tricky as demons.
He pocketed his phone and went to go get water from his kitchen sink. When Lance exited the bathroom, Keith already had a message prepared on his notes app for him to see. "Do you need to eat?" Lance pursed his lips as he read the text. Then he quickly typed something back. "I'm hungry, but I can live without food." So exactly like me then, he thought. He knew from experience that Lance needed food. At one point, he had tried surviving on virtually no food, and that had turned out terribly. He was alive, but it was painful. Keith typed a message and handed Lance the phone before heading over to what he liked to call his laundry corner. He grabbed some flip-flops that were a little big on him and threw them over at Lance's feet. It wasn't enough to protect Lance's feet, but it was better than nothing. As he explained in his message, Lance and him were going to get breakfast at a small local cafe. First, Keith would need Lance's help with an odd job. Shay had a garden plot outside of her shop, and Keith had set up an agreement with the florist. Every 3 days, the demon would come and pick as many flowers as he could for some cash. It wasn't much compared to some of the other jobs he had, but it was enough for some food. Specifically, for Lance and him to get a proper breakfast. He usually wouldn't dare spend money on a cafe, but he, for some reason, didn't feel Lance would appreciate surviving off of only ramen. Why did he care? He wasn't sure. And Keith was not used to mulling over his spontaneous decisions. Shay's flower shop was a decent walk away, and Keith could instantly tell by how Lance clumsily walked that he was probably used to flying. Lance had his wings tucked close, and despite Keith not being able to see them, it seemed no one on the street could. He made a mental note to ask about that later. Keith opened the gates of the garden and stepped inside, and he half expected it to shut behind him like usual. However, Lance stalled the usual sound by entering as well. This mildly annoyed him for some reason, but he distracted himself by trying to figure out which flowers were most abundant. It seemed the white and blue tulips were thriving, so he strode confidently over to those. He waved Lance over, who was hesitantly stepping and trying to avoid trampling over anything. His wings brushed against some flowers, and he literally yelped, his wings unfurling a bit, until he realized he had been startled by some peonies. Keith chuckled as he started picking some flowers carefully, soon seeing out of the corner of his eye that Lance had finally made it to his side. Lance started trying to copy Keith, looking to Keith for approval. It was obvious the angel kept trying to avoid getting dirt on his hands, but it was kind of inevitable. Though Keith would usually criticize someone for this, it would be hard to communicate that when they couldn't talk. Keith hesitantly nodded at Lance and continued to collect more flowers. Keith got a little into the zone of mindlessly picking flowers while a gentle wind whistled in his ears, which is why he jumped slightly when he heard Lance sneeze. He was going to brush it off, till Lance sneezed again, and again. It kept happening, in short intervals too. Looking over at Lance, he could tell that the man's face was getting a little red. Was this a pollen allergy? He could remember Shay asking if he had one. It was mildly embarrassing, having Shay explain to him what an allergy was, but at least he learned what it could look like. He put a hand on Lance's shoulder before standing up, collecting his flowers in his arms. Angling his head and bobbing it towards the gate, he hoped the gesture would communicate that they were going. Lance seemed to be grateful, but continued to sneeze even when they had left the garden. He would angle his head to sneeze into his shoulder to the side every time, so at least he wasn't sneezing all over the flowers. When they entered the shop, Shay was at the front desk and greeted Keith with a smile.
Knew you weren't going to be late. Did you get a friend to help you?
Her gentle and small voice seemed to be innocently inquiring about Lance, which secretly relieved Keith. He was a little worried about how she would feel about extra help. Would it be like cheating, since he got paid for the amount of flowers he brought to her? Yeah, this is Lance. He's my roommate and fell on some hard times like me. Shay looked sympathetic, and she took the flowers from the two of them. Keith could hear Lance chirp, and Shay let out a giggle.
Pollen allergy, huh? I have a tissue container I can give you in the bag. Hang on for a moment.
She went to find tissues for Lance while Keith crossed his arms. He was a little frustrated he was not able to hear what Lance was saying. It's not like he could ask Shay. To her, it wouldn't make any sense why Keith couldn't understand his new roommate. After what could have been a few seconds to a few minutes, Keith saw Shay come back with bills and tissues. Keith was given the cash and he instantly started counting. $56? Shay, you're overpaying me.
It's more like a tip. You've been helping here for a while, and I'm sure you deserve some kindness every once in a while.
He really did not deserve kindness, and this sort of pity-muddy would usually bother him. However, attempting to give the money back likely would make a scene. Keith was already dealing with Lance, and he had bigger problems than pity money from a florist. Hunger, for one. He let Lance throw some tissues in a waste bin before ushering him out the door. Lance was looking around in wonder as Keith led him towards the cafe. The sound of flip-flops behind Keith would suddenly stop sometimes, and he would have to turn around to see Lance admiring something. It took 3 times before Keith started to become fed up. Lance was currently stunned by a wall mural of the sea, with a giant shark in its center. Man, it's a fucking shark. Have you never seen one before? He didn't really mind his words. Lance couldn't understand after all. At this point, he took Lance's wrist and basically dragged him away from the mural. The cafe was buzzing with activity, and it shocked Keith that no one had knocked into Lance's wings at all. Even as a couple brushed past them out the entrance, he could have sworn a man was actively avoiding the wings. Keith furrowed his brow before an older woman asked them how many were dining. Lance must have responded when he chirped because they were now being guided to an empty booth. It was nice to sit down, and his stomach was growling already. While they waited, he took in the scenery. The cafe was well lit. That was thanks to the sunlight pouring in through the large windows to his left. In this light, he could especially appreciate Lance's wings. They were almost pure white, looking as if they were shimmering. A few blemishes here and there, but the coloring was almost perfect. He realized instead of taking in the cafe scenery, he was focused on Lance. Lance looked expectant, his longer than normal nails tapping against the table in a rhythm. Lance raised an eyebrow, and then leaned over the table to point at Keith's pocket. Oh, his phone. Keith dug it out, opened the notes app, and handed it over to the angel. Lance nodded in appreciation. After a minute or so, the phone slid back to him. There on the screen was, "You should tell me more about demons." What could he even say? That was an incredibly broad question for Keith to attempt to answer. He wouldn't want to tell Lance anything that could be used to his own detriment, like weaknesses. His eyes wandered, and so did his mind. A waitress came over, and they both got water as he looked down at the query. Keith finally had an idea when he felt the blade in his pocket, always there for him. Most demons carry blades, and they can kill other beings, such as angels. He slid the phone back, and then immediately realized Lance could take that little piece of information the wrong way. Lance did a chirpy giggle again when he saw what Keith had put, so at least it wasn't an extremely awful reaction. "Are you threatening me?" Keith looked down at his phone with a little smirk. This seemed to be good-natured. It soothed his worries that Lance may actually be teasing him. Maybe. While Lance typed, the waitress came over and asked them what they would like to eat. She repeated Lance's order back to him, so Keith knew he was getting a breakfast sandwich with bacon and eggs. For him, though, what did he even want? Something cheap. His eyes gravitated towards the sides. "Can I have tater tots?" The woman raised an eyebrow, but did write it down.
"Will that be all, sir?"
She was attempting to sound kind, but Keith could tell when he was being judged. She likely thought of him as a homeless guy, with his unkempt hair and small order. Maybe he could see a bit of pity with how she looked at him as well. Humans were easier to read than he initially expected. Demons were more reserved when it came to facial expressions, and it took him some time to get used to the more expressive human world. Yes, I'm not particularly hungry. Keith raked a hand through his hair, and it instantly found a knot. He sighed and lowered his hand, looking away from the waitress. She took their menus and whisked them away towards the kitchens. He gazed out the window for a few moments before his phone slid back to him. I will admit that would not be the worst way to go. I know what to expect with you stabbing me, at least. Almost got stabbed before, remember? Did angels have memory problems? Did angels believe demons had memory problems? Why was he asking if Keith remembered? Keith didn't really understand the question's true intentions. Yeah, it was yesterday. I do have a question for you now. What would be the worst way for you to go then? He was genuinely curious. What would an angel be afraid of dying to? He leaned back against the booth's cushioning, which was somehow more comfortable than the mattress he had back in his apartment. Sometimes, he wished he would have given in to the temptation to be a thief or even lead a life of extreme crime for money, but he wouldn't have liked to have risked angel attention. Oh wait, he got that without even doing anything! Lance slid his response back to Keith. Probably drowning, my worst fear. Keith was surprised to see Lance still seemed to be in high spirits, casually sipping his water and playing with the straw wrappers on the table. Why would an angel be afraid of drowning? Maybe... I'm guessing your wings won't let you swim properly? He took a guess, then typed it hesitantly. He was going to be embarrassed if he ended up being wrong about this, though he shouldn't be. He slid the phone back just as their food came. Lance thankfully did not seem interested in the food just yet. Keith was itching for a response. Yep, I love water. It sucks balls. Keith snorted at that response, holding a hand over his mouth and folding forward to stop himself from laughing openly. He typed back, Did an angel just tell me something sucks balls? Their food disappeared fairly quickly after that, and soon the two were outside once again. Keith then had to mow a lawn, and he let Lance chill with the old lady who was paying him. She thanked him and paid him the same amount as always. She did seem to like Lance, commenting that he was sweet. At least Lance wasn't sabotaging any of his jobs so far. However, as they started to head back to the apartment for lunch, Lance was looking more desolate. His gaze was downturned, and he looked almost uncomfortable, his feathers puffing out on all ends. Keith ended up becoming so concerned that he stopped and pulled out his phone. What's wrong? Lance bit at his bottom lip, typing a response faster than usual. Keith was handed back the phone, but it was more like it was shoved into his hands. Could you not feel it? She reminds me of my grandma. She's dying soon. Heart is going to fail. Can't do anything about it. That shook Keith inside, not being able to do anything about death. Demons had no participation in the human life cycle unless they crawled out of the underworld and caused harm themselves. Angels were ingrained in the process. He wondered how Lance felt about that. The two silently walked home after that, and when Keith kicked off his shoes at the door, Lance copied him. Lance also copied him when Keith lay down, and the angel curled up on his designated side of the bed. Keith was tired physically. Mowing the old woman's lawn with that faulty lawnmower took a lot out of him. He could hear Lance chirping, talking, but, of course, he couldn't understand. He wished he could understand. An idea came to him. The vent. Well, more particularly, what was inside of it. Did he even still have that damn screwdriver?